As the saying goes, consistency builds trust. For decades, the US has been a global superpower, but in just over 3 weeks, President Donald Trump has bewildered friends and bamboozled foes. So how will his second term reshape the role of the US on the world stage? And can the world still trust the US? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. There's growing international uncertainty about what America stands for or what it's committed to. Last week, President Donald Trump proposed the US take over Gaza and forcibly relocate Palestinians. He announced tariffs on Mexico and Canada. Within hours, the levies were put on hold for 30 days. Many are still reeling from Trump's first term when he withdrew the US from the Iran nuclear deal, a carefully crafted agreement with world powers to limit Tehran's nuclear development. He also reversed President Barack Obama's opening to Cuba, left the UN cultural agency UNESCO, and pulled out of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Now he has defence alliance NATO on edge, hinting at a US withdrawal unless members increase military spending. Negotiating tactics or not, Trump's actions may have already caused irreparable damage. So how will countries react, and will his second presidency speed up the emergence of a new world order?
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
Drill, baby, drill.
The first item that President Trump is signing is the rescission of 78 Biden-era executive actions.
The word tariff, properly used, is a beautiful word.
We're thinking in terms of 25% on Mexico and Canada because they're allowing vast numbers of people. Canada's a very bad abuser also. Vast numbers of people to come in and fentanyl to come in. Well, the European Union charges us 20% plus, and we are treated so badly. Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled. We're protecting them, you know. They're not protecting us, so I don't think we should be spending. I'm not sure we should be spending anything.
What money are you going to use to buy Gaza?
We're not going to buy anything. We're going to have it. We're going to keep it, and we're going to make sure that there's going to be peace. Saturday at 12 o'clock, if they're not here, all hell is going to break out.
Well, let's meet today's panel who are going to discuss all of this with us. In Dublin, we have Scott Lucas, who's Professor of US and International Politics at University College Dublin. From Doha, we're joined by Ibrahim Fraihat, an Associate Professor of Conflict Resolution at the Doha Institute of Graduate Studies. And in Vienna, Roger Hilton, a non-resident fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a specialist on NATO and Euro-Atlantic security. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today on Inside Story. It is just over 3 weeks since Donald Trump was inaugurated the 47th President of the US. Ibrahim, such a whirlwind and fire hose of far-reaching decisions. It doesn't seem like 3 weeks.
Well, yes, this actually makes us wonder if this is all happening in 3 weeks, how is it going to look like for the rest of the 4 years, the second term for Donald Trump? In the 3 weeks, he has declared a war on the entire world, from China to Canada to Europe to the Middle East. He has lost the trust among his even closest allies, the European Union, NATO, with his neighbors, Mexico and Canada. And he caused disasters actually here in the region, in the Middle East, where after 15 months of a genocide that's the world is watching live on TV for the past 15 months, instead of stopping the genocide, he has declared a new disaster, actually, of new displacement of the Palestinians or in Gaza, despite all the displacements that they have been going through over the past decades. So it doesn't look like we're going to go on a quiet 4 years with Donald Trump, and we should be, the world should be ready and prepared how to deal with someone with such thinking in the White House and how to respond to him.
Scott, it's worth pointing out, isn't it, that all the things he's done are actually executive orders. In other countries, you'd call them presidential decrees. None of this was legislation that went through Congress. Now, one of the reasons that the US system of government is respected and trusted around the world is the system of checks and balances, the three co-equal branches of power. What happened to all of that?
It's gone, or at least the Trump administration, including effectively an unelected co-president, Elon Musk, don't believe in checks and balances. We're going to be talking about foreign affairs, but this is in the context of an attempt by Trump and Musk to tear down the U.S. system by trying to get unauthorized access to records involving trillions of dollars, by using 19 to 26-year-old men to do that, by trying to undermine and even destroy agencies such as the U.S. Agency for International Development, by trying to purge thousands of employees, including senior staff, including the heads of oversight boards, because this is an attempt, and we need to be honest here, to move to an autocracy. And to get an autocracy, you have to try to bypass Congress or bend it to its will, which it succeeded in doing so far, because the Republicans, who have the majority in both houses, are not opposing Trump, and you have to bypass the courts or say they're illegitimate, which we're on the verge of talking about with J.D. Vance, the vice president, saying just last weekend that the court should not be able to make legal rulings on executive action. The U.S. has always had a very strong executive. There's been a lot of presidential power, but up until now, it has been within a system in which there was a collaboration between the three branches of government. We're in a new era now. We're talking about both at home and abroad that Donald Trump and Mr. Musk, they function not for alliances, they function not for America, they function not for checks and balances, they function for Donald Trump alone.
Roger, Inauguration Day, as Ibrahim said, only just over 3 weeks ago. I was there in DC. Given everything that happens, it seems an awfully long time ago. But we go back to that day. One of the first of many executive orders on that day was pulling out of the Paris climate deal for the second time. Trump did it back in 2017. So can the US, do you think, in any way now be trusted by the world with regard to the climate crisis, arguably the most important issue for the planet?
Thank you for the invite. If you don't mind, before touching on climate, I just wanted to respond to what one of my colleagues had mentioned in Doha. He started off his intervention by saying that, in the first 3 weeks, Donald Trump had irreversibly damaged the relations between allies. There's no doubt that there has been a shock and there's a new dynamic of negotiations. But 3 weeks in my opinion, it's just too early to say so bluntly that, the relations are irreversible. Yes, there's been some very inappropriate and unfortunate comments regarding, let's say, Greenland or even my own country from Canada. But I think it's important to realize that these countries, whether it's Denmark, Canada, they are adapting. And just last week, in a rare moment, you had the Japanese PM who was coming, who is on good relations. So this is not a walk in the park with Donald Trump. You have to earn his trust. Obviously, you have to bring something to the table, but I just think at the beginning for our viewers, things maybe aren't as terrible.
Got your point. But on climate, can the US now be trusted on this issue at all?
Well, listen, no, I don't. I think the only advantage of him coming back is this was not a big surprise. I think everybody expected it. It gave the international community the time and the opportunity to plan for it. Unfortunately, due to sort of the weak economic situation of Europe, I think the real victims of this are going to be the islands and all of the countries who are most exposed to it. But as I said, climate security and climate control, climate change in general was not one of his priorities. So I don't think people should be shocked by this. And just because he's pulled out of this doesn't mean it applies to other things like Article 5 for NATO.
OK, Ibrahim, in terms of US international agreements and treaties, not just the climate deal, there are so many. He pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal last time he was president. He pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now we've got the threats against Panama. There's a treaty there. There was a treaty that the US signed originally in 1977 when Jimmy Carter was president. Does the US's word stand for anything? And does that matter on other issues? For example, the Abraham Accords, which Trump wants to expand.
Well, additionally to all the shocking things that Trump is doing, Actually, it's the colleague from Vienna. It's also shocking that he is still considering, what Trump is planning to do or what Trump is saying. He's openly, clearly called for the annexation of Canada, right? A neighbor, a NATO member, right? And he tweeted on that, right? Putting the American flag on North America. Clearly. So this is something that's done by Donald Trump himself. Not only this, but also we have seen 4 years of his term in the first term, and we've seen what he has done during that time. And also, this is the second time withdrawing from the climate agreement, Paris Climate Agreement. So what additional evidence that do we need to see that in order to what he calls to earn the trust, you have someone who's calling for the displacement of an entire population in Gaza, right, undermining international law. We should all be extremely concerned, not only about what Trump's saying, but the implications for international law, undermining international law, whether it's in terms of withdrawing from the climate change agreement or for continuing a genocide, basically another form of genocide. And here he's raising the threshold for what the world community is or can tolerate in terms of what Trump is coming from a superpower, calling for a clear displacement of an entire community.
Panama, for example, the Panama Canal, but more importantly, perhaps, because they're NATO countries, Greenland, which is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and Canada, which he, as we heard there, he wants to make the 51st state, he says. I mean, these are close friends of the United States. That's the bit that seems most shocking to me. I mean, even if he doesn't follow through on some of these things, what do you think it sets as a precedent, given the backdrop of the invasion of Ukraine, given the fact that we know China thinks that Taiwan belongs to China?
Well, I think that's an interesting contrast between Ibrahim and Roger in how they see Trump. Ibrahim's point of view is that you just can't deal with Trump, that there's no way to engage with it. Whereas if I understand Rogers correctly, he's saying, look, you can still engage with Trump on specific issues like the Japanese have tried to do. I mean, my point of view here is that you can engage with Trump, but you can engage with him as a transactional president. In other words, you have to give Trump something which is not something for America. It's something that makes Donald Trump look good. And that may not match up to American interest. It certainly doesn't match up to multilateral interest. I think that's the starting point. The Trump folks don't think in terms of multilateralism. As Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, said, the post-war international order is obsolete. And that means former allies have to recalibrate. The European Union has to recalibrate. Gulf states have to recalibrate. Japan has to recalibrate how they make these approaches. My worry here, beyond all of this is, and this is what's different about Trump 2.0, is that Trump is damaging the U.S. institutions that you deal with. So, for example, there is a ban on climate change. You cannot mention it if you're a U.S. agency now. U.S. scientists are barred from collaborating with international colleagues, not only on environmental issues, but on health issues. The State Department, the FBI, intelligence agencies are effectively being told, you are paralyzed and cannot act until you prove you are loyal to Donald Trump. That's the worry here. Whether we talk about dealing with allies or with adversaries, the U.S. system itself may not be able to function effectively on any of these key issues that we're going to talk about today.
Roger, as an expert, but also as a Canadian, because Canada has been in the firing line in the last couple of weeks, what do you think about the way this is being done, the way Donald Trump does this? Because there's no quiet negotiation or quiet diplomacy. It's all done very, very publicly, very impulsively, very aggressively. That's not the way allies normally talk to each other.
I mean, if I'm being quite honest with you, I don't think I felt much worse in my life than hearing some of the comments coming from the president. Canada has gone to war with the United States. We have the longest undefended border. There's so much, not just the trade, but the cultural relations. So, of course, I mean, Elon Musk coming on and referring to the prime minister as just a governor of the 51st state is quite frankly beyond despicable. But again, going back to what Scott said and my colleague in Doha, I mean, obviously, look, nobody wants to hear this. And as the PM said, we don't want this trade war, but, we have huge things at stake financially. And of course, the Canadian government and Ottawa has moved heaven and hell to try to avoid this trade war. Of course, they've accelerated a lot of things that had already been agreed to, but this is no way to really talk to allies. But unfortunately, this is the reality we are in, and it takes, a new dynamic and a new language to communicate. And behind the scenes, at least speaking from the Canadian perspective, while not perfect, things are still going on fairly well between Secretary of State Rubio and Foreign Minister Joly. Same thing with the National Security Advisor. So whether it's Panama, Canada, Japan, Denmark, whoever the next country is, we all have to adapt to the new situation. And as you see with Europe, I mean, they've also put forward a whole host of options about trying to avoid the trade war, whether it's buying more LNG, buying more American arms to sort of push this off. But I mean, this is the world we're in right now, and it's adapt or die.
I mean, Ibrahim, there may be many people around the world who never fully trusted the US. It's like any other country. It has its own national interest, but they perhaps at least knew where they thought the US stood. They trusted where the US stood on issues. And one of the things it used to stand for was help for the poor and needy around the world. And now we've seen what's happened to US aid. I mean, how concerned are you about that development?
Thank you. Well, let me link this actually to what my colleagues have said. And I'm not against engagement. I'm a conflict resolution professor, and I spent my entire life, my career, actually advocating for engagement. But we should be clear about what things we can engage with. Yes, we can engage on interest of how we can maximize our own interest and how we can negotiate. But my friends, we cannot engage or negotiate, right, with Donald Trump on issues that are related to international law, not on values of a human society, not on sovereignty of a neighboring country that's calling for annexation of a neighboring country. I cannot engage with a president, a superpower president, on values of negotiating with him whether to displace a whole community, forced displacement, and continuation of genocide. There is no engagement on this ground. Sovereignty, human values, there is no engagement on these levels. There is a confrontation on them. And that's the difference between my colleagues and I. Engagement can happen on maximization of interest. And back to your question on a humanitarian intervention, US aid, right? There will be millions and millions of people will be affected as a result of the war that he declared on US aid. That has been serving poor people, hospitals, school education in many marginalized communities around the world. That they're going to be affected as a result of the mass Trump attack war declaring on US aid. Those communities are going to suffer immensely, and they're going to experience disasters. I cannot engage on these values. And that's where Donald Trump should be confronted, not engaged with. Not only this, in the first term, he cut the total funding on UNRWA that's supporting about 7 million Palestinian refugees. Total cut that he made that they were affected as a result of this. Now he is pushing for again the shutdown of UNRWA, whereas that's supporting that's the most needed at this time during the genocide that's happening in Gaza. Mm-hmm. How can we engage on this?
Okay, let me just move it on, if you don't mind, Ibrahim, and bring in Scott.
If you can allow me just one final point, very quickly. With the humanitarian dimensions, it's not only going to be these communities affected, it's the U.S. national interest that is going to be affected. And Mark Rubio knows this very well. Go back to his speeches in the Congress, that he was one of the strongest advocates for securing national interest, American national interest through U.S. aid. And
Okay,
now,
thank you for that. Thank you for that, Ibrahim. Scott, bringing you in now. We're less than 2 weeks away from what is the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let me read you. I've got so many of these quotes I could have read you, but the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, this is from 2022, "We are prepared for the long haul. We'll support them for as long as it takes." Now, given that sounds very hollow now, given where we are. I mean, do you think Ukraine can trust the US or NATO for that matter?
Certainly, Ukraine cannot trust the Trump administration. And certainly the starting point, and I agree with Ibrahim on this, is that, you cannot engage with Donald Trump when it comes to, for example, ethnic cleansing of Gaza. That's unacceptable. And the question regarding Ukraine and Russia is, can you engage with the Trump administration to ensure continued support of Ukraine against that invasion, which is going to be entering its fourth term fairly soon? Here we have a bit of a complexity where you can't necessarily go on a yes-no issue. And that is, first of all, Donald Trump himself doesn't have much knowledge of Ukraine and Russia. So the question is, what form would that negotiation take? The starting point for that probably is that Ukraine will accept a Russian occupation of parts of Ukraine in the short term in return for security guarantees, whether that's an actual invitation to join NATO or a guarantee of support from NATO members with continued aid. Now, there are certain members of the Trump administration who have indicated they may be open to this. That includes the envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. It includes the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. The problem here is will they be the adults in the room who will be listened to, or will Trump, in terms of being very impetuous, decide, look, on his own accord, or through someone like his personal friend, Steve Witkoff, we're going to negotiate directly with the Russians. There are indications that Trump is actually moving towards that point of view. I think we'll see at the Munich Security Conference this weekend, where Vladimir Zelensky will meet U.S. officials for the first time, Vice President Vance, Treasury Secretary Bessent, whether or not you can not trust the United States, whether or not the Trump administration can be part of the conversation for the long-term security of Ukraine, or whether Ukraine and the rest of the international community has to step up to give Ukraine those assurances while the United States may put itself on the sidelines or even on the side of Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, Scott, I think Munich will be important, and I'm going to be there covering it for Al Jazeera. Roger, NATO, 75 years old last year. They gather again for their summit in June. Donald Trump will be there. Give us an idea, not just on Ukraine, but how do you think NATO allies are going to be feeling right now? Pretty uneasy, I would think.
Yeah, James, if I just may comment back on what Scott said, I mean, obviously the way Kiev and the Zelensky administration is dealing with it, I mean, I think they've actually stepped up to the plate quite well. They understand the audience, and correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, I mean, I think you have Treasury Secretary Bessent now in Kiev looking at sort of the rare earth minerals and whatnot. So again, just for the viewers, I mean, it's not an optimal situation, but Kiev has adapted to the situation. They know that this is sort of a legacy issue for Trump about getting peace. So again, whether it's the rare earth minerals...
yeah, but Roger, the rare earths, for example. I mean, the US used to do things because it believed in freedom and democracy, not for transactional reasons, didn't it?
I agree, but I mean, at the moment, the number one priority for Kiev right now is survival and making sure that the line doesn't collapse any faster than it's going now. Again, it's not things would have been much different if Vice President Harris had won it, but this is the reality of the situation, and they're evolving as things go. We can talk on another episode about values and whatnot, but as I said, I mean, Russia now, there was the prisoner exchange yesterday, and as you see from the tweets also, James, I mean, it's, Trump has said massive sanctions to come unless Russia comes to the table. Russia doesn't seem inclined to want to negotiate right now at the moment. So the way the optics are looking, at least it might be better for Kiev. When it comes to NATO, I mean, 75 years, there's been all types of flavors of issues. 1974 with Turkey and Cyprus, you had the Iraq War. Again, I think just like my earlier comment about the Paris Climate Accord, I mean, I think people and the brain trust within NATO have thought about this for a while. There's a lot of backup plans. You have Secretary General Rutte who I think is quite good at dealing with Trump. And even if you go back to the 2018 NATO summit in Brussels, where, that was the one where Trump in the room was talking about leaving, Rutte was the one who convinced them about taking all the credit for the spending. You have 24 of the 32 allies where spending is up. And I think moving towards Hague, obviously the atmosphere is not necessarily maybe so jovial, but it is the wake-up call that NATO allies, including my country, need to do about spending more. Trump is looking at a 5% target where, if I read correctly this morning, Poland is going to come in at 4.7% this year, and anything north of 3%. And tactically speaking, all of the sabotage, asymmetrical warfare that we've seen in the north, you've had NATO really step up with the Baltic Sentry Force. Now the EU is getting more involved about taking down the ghost fleets, which 80% of Russia's crude is exiting on. So again, this is another example of NATO adapting, and more importantly, another clear sign about why they need to spend more, whether it's to appease Trump, to push off the threat of Trump, with the Danish intelligence service saying that in the next 5 years they could attack. And last one, Europe's competitiveness, innovation, this is long overdue, outlined in the Letta and Draghi reports. So maybe the shock that Europe needs to get their act together when it comes to defense spending.
Scott, very briefly at the end, we've still got most of the 4-year term of Trump to come, but do you think some of the things that have happened already are going to change things for good? Can the world return to business as usual after Trump?
Not at the moment, because while there may be the ability to deal with Trump, even to maneuver with Trump on individual issues, we've talked about tariffs, for example. We've talked about Ukraine, for example. On other issues, there is not room to maneuver with Trump right now. Israel, Gaza is one of them. But more importantly is the context of that beyond Trump, you have to talk about what is the state of the U.S. system. And here we need to be open and clear. What is being carried out right now in the most serious threat to the United States in peacetime since 1865 is an attempt by Donald Trump and his allies, including people like Stephen Miller, including people like Elon Musk, to break the U.S. system. Entire agencies like USAID suddenly swept aside. The records of other agencies, from the Treasury being stolen, even the records of the Pentagon being at risk, the prospect of the head of American National Intelligence being someone who has been sympathetic to people like Bashar al-Assad in Syria, Vladimir Putin in Russia. You can choose Donald Trump or you can choose the U.S. system in the long term. You cannot choose both. That will be an issue first and foremost for Americans, but it will be one that the world will have to reckon with in not only the next few weeks, but the months and years to come.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. Scott Lucas, Ibrahim Fraihat and Roger Hilton. If you didn't catch all of our discussion, don't worry. You can watch this and any of our programmes again whenever you want on our website, aljazeera.com. If you have ideas for future topics we should discuss on this programme, please share them with us on Facebook, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or message us on X, where our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From the Inside Story team and me, James Bays, please stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.